Oh, has that changed the screen for everybody? Well, I'm sorry, I'm having to ask this, and you've just said
it has.
I pressed got it when it said recording in progress, and it's changed the screen. Let's try again. Sorry. Right, there we go. Right, so thanks everyone for joining us this evening. You'll notice it says here, thank you for your donation. And I should explain that because Carla and I are doing this for nothing, and we thought if at the end of the presentation you think, do you know what, that was worth a £5 or 50 quid, that you might like to make a donation either to Butterfly Conservation or the Parks Trust, but it's entirely down to you. And if at the moment you're experiencing some financial hardship and you think I'll do it another time because I'm a bit stony at the moment, that's good too. All right.
Right, let me just mute all and then I'll unmute.
Okay. All right, we're back again. So those who've heard my talks before will know that this is, in my opinion, the very best advice I can give you. That when you're identifying butterflies, most of the species you're looking at which are difficult to identify, the easiest thing to do is sort of ignore the middle of the butterfly and look at the wing edges, the wing tips, and the very edges. If in addition you get an idea of the shape of the wing, that might help. Some are more rounded, some are more triangular, but it's the wing edges which is so important. If you're looking at a butterfly and you notice it's got a particular ground colour, let's say it's white, that isn't much help apart from getting you into the right family, because there are lots of butterflies that are white. But the wing edges of the white butterflies are really helpful. Once you've spotted the wing edges and seen the details that you think might help, then worry about what's towards the middle. And having said all that, I'm now going to say that in addition, try and look to see what the butterfly is doing. So there's a lot to try and take in, especially if you only get a fleeting glimpse. But what is the butterfly doing? Is it chasing after other insects? Not necessarily butterflies, it might be bees, but it probably will be other butterflies it's chasing, in which case you're probably looking at a male. And the males might be a different colour from the females. In some species they are. And then also, is it flying around plants and looking to lay eggs on them, in which case, fairly obviously, it's almost certainly a female. So wing edges and what the butterfly is doing are very helpful. The actual colour of the butterfly is helpful, but not down to species. That helps you to get the family, not the species. And we're going to look first of all at the nymphalids. That's the colourful group, the group that some call the aristocrats. And these butterflies are actually quite easy to tell apart because they are so colourful that you can look at them and you can see things you need to see from their colour. And the first thing you'll notice when they fly past you is that some of them are quite orange, like the tortoiseshell and the comma, and some are very dark, like the peacock and the red admiral. The painted lady usually does look orange when it flies past, but it can look pinky coloured. But obviously nothing like the very dark peacock and red admiral that can look black in certain conditions. So here's a peacock, and I really can't imagine anyone's going to have too much trouble identifying a peacock because of these fantastic eyes. So looking at the edges of the wing, one of the things you pick up is that there are eyes at the wing tips on the forewings, and there are eyes near the top of the hind wings too. So that one should be pretty easy because no other butterfly has got such colourful eyes. Some have eyes, but none as colourful as this. The orange species that I mentioned, the comma, up here, top left, the small tortoiseshell below it, and then the painted lady, top right. These can be a bit difficult to tell apart if they only fly past, and there will be occasions when these butterflies fly past and you have to accept, I'm not sure what it was, because you didn't get sufficient to look at it. But if you look at the comma, you'll see that it doesn't have the same well-defined stripes on this leading edge of the wing. Look how much more boldly marked the small tortoiseshell is. In between the black on the leading edge, the tortoiseshell has really white or creamy coloured marks, whereas the comma the orange ground colour of the wing, maybe it gets a bit paler towards the edge, but it's pretty much the same colour as the rest of the wing. So there's a huge contrast here. This wing edge is very helpful. And if you would like a bit more wing edge help, look at the wing edge on the tortoiseshell down the side. There are always these little blue marks. Now they might get a bit worn, abraded with time, but on a fairly fresh specimen, those blue dots along here, they're really visible. In contrast, look, the comma has yellowy marks. So a lot of differences actually, even though superficially they're similar. And of course, if all you see is a silhouette, then the fact that the comma has got this peculiar shape with great big notches taken out of the wing makes it very easy. The tortoiseshell is much more a typical butterfly shape, but the comma's got this very ragged appearance. The painted lady, superficially, I suppose you might say, it looks quite a bit more like the tortoiseshell, but no blue. And the thing about the painted lady that usually helps me spot it in a moment is that it's got so much white in the black at the wing tips. So black and white wing tips, not the same with the comma or the tortoiseshell, in the sense that here we've got a big area of black and lots of little white dots. Okay. Now the red admiral shares those same wingtips. If you look, you'll see they are almost identical. But the red admiral, of course, have red bands on a black background. So this will look very dark. And when it lands, you'll see those red bands. The painted lady looks orange, but the tips of the wings are almost identical. I've made this note here, but later in the year, you might see fritillaries and think the fritillaries look very similar to this, but they do not have this black tip with the white marks inside them. So the fritillaries are orange all the way to at the top of the wing and the edge of the wing. Okay. The underside of these butterflies, the nymphalids, are slightly more difficult. But I think we can see here the red admiral is much darker on the underside as it was on the upper side. And we've still got a red stripe, usually just visible here. The painted lady has a much sandier appearance, and it has a series of eyes on the hind wing. They are never as prominent on the red admiral, but if you stare really hard, use a bit of imagination, there's something similar. These butterflies are very closely related. But painted lady, always paler. Okay, now this butterfly is one of the browns. Only two brown butterflies fly in the spring, and this one on the underside does look a bit like the red admiral looked. Obviously there's no red, you can see that, but the speckled wood can cause confusion to some people because they go out looking perhaps for tortoiseshell, comma, and so on, don't expect to see a brown butterfly in the spring, and then think, well, that must have been a tortoiseshell or a comma because it looked sort of orangey. But as I think you can see, it's much darker with lots of pale spots and hasn't got the same stripes as the tortoiseshell, hasn't got the blue edges, and overall has a very different appearance on the hind wing with lots of little eye spots around the hind wing. So this butterfly, speckled wood, which is usually seen near woodland or in woodland, then this butterfly is a member of the same family, but a very different type of butterfly. Far more rounded wings, a far more relaxed approach to life. It doesn't zip about quite as much as the red admiral, painted lady, tortoiseshell, and so on. Okay, we're moving on to look at the underside of the butterflies in this group, because they do look similar, but there are differences. First thing is that the comma has a very wavy outline, which I think you can see here. I said it looks like it's got notches missing from it. And it's obviously two-tone, isn't it? Paler out and darker inner. The tortoiseshell does have paler and outer, but again, that blue band is still visible, the one that was on the upper side. Nothing like as notched, not as uneven as the comma. The peacock, similar in shape to the tortoiseshell, a little bit bigger, but none of the colour. The tortoiseshell looks far more colourful. This can look almost completely black, whereas there is a difference between the inner and outer on both the tortoiseshell and the comma, the peacock. Not much difference really between the inner and the outer. And then the speckled wood, which I hope you can see, has got various eye spots. You can't see them here very well, but one thing you can see clearly in this picture is the way that, whereas these butterflies, tortoiseshell, comma, and peacock, appear to have a relatively flat surface to their hind wing, the speckled wood has a sort of fluted appearance. The veins and the rest of the wing are held at slightly different angles, so you get these little shadows thrown if the sun is shining, which is another good way of telling them apart. So those are the nymphalids. In my opinion, because they're so colourful on the upper surface, they're quite easy to tell if they sit with their wings open, which they often do. But if you do see them with their wings shut, they can be tricky. This is the way to tell them apart. Wavy outline and quite contrasted. Contrasted with a blue band still. Hardly any contrast, hardly any difference from one edge to the other. And this one with some eye spots and a fluted appearance. So comma, tortoiseshell, speckled wood, peacock. Right, we're moving on to the whites, and the whites include two butterflies which are yellow. So this is the white family, and two of them are yellow. On this side, we've got the brimstone, and the brimstone has these very pointy wingtips. And when you see it flying, it looks a really lemony yellow colour, very bright lemon yellow colour. On the right-hand side here, we've got the clouded yellow. Now, the clouded yellow is a summer migrant, but it is being seen in very small numbers in southern counties at the minute, so it might get to us in the next week or so because the weather's supposed to get a lot warmer. It looks slightly smaller than the brimstone, and the yellow is much deeper and darker, more like a custard colour. So lemon for the brimstone, custard yellow for the clouded yellow. And if you notice, they've both got dark spots on the yellow, but this clouded yellow always has this white centre to the hind wing spot. And, probably much more helpful, there are no pointy wingtips. Nothing on the wingtips of the clouded yellow that even hint at the spiky points on the wingtips of the brimstone. But you can get a variation in the colour of a female clouded yellow where it looks very pale and looks similar to a large white, but always you've got this pink circle with a white centre, even on the pale female clouded yellows, which comprise about, I think they're about a quarter of all the females are this paler colour. So you will normally see either the custard yellow male or a custard yellow female, but you might see a very pale female clouded yellow. Brimstone and clouded yellow. Okay. Unfortunately, after saying you might want to notice the ground colour for the nymphalids, we now learn that, well, that's not much help with the whites. This is, in my opinion, this is the trickiest group. So steel yourself. We'll go through this, and at the end of it, you'll all understand how to tell the whites apart very easily. But there is quite a bit to remember, I'm afraid, because it isn't a matter of simply look at it and see if it's a bright colour. They're all white, and the difference we're looking for is pretty small, and it's mostly in the amount of black on the wings. If you see them fly past you, you get a clue from their size. So the smallest is the wood white, and that is a very feeble flyer. The female orange tip is usually the next biggest, slightly bigger than a wood white, and it's also a bit feeble. It tends to flutter about rather than fly strongly. The green veined white and the small white are both quite strong flyers and slightly bigger. These two are almost identical in size. The fact that it's called small white isn't because it's smaller than the green vein, it's because it's smaller than the large white, usually. So these two are slightly bigger than the orange tip, but they fly with much more purpose. If you see an even bigger white butterfly, then it could be a female brimstone because only the males are yellow, or it could be a large white. And we'll look now at the differences, assuming they stop, because that's the worst thing about the whites. They're very good at flying long distances without stopping. So you may well see one and want to have a closer look at it, but it won't oblige. That's the biggest problem with them. If you're doing a survey for butterfly conservation and you have permission of the landowner wherever you are doing your survey, then I would suggest try catching them in a net, because they don't stop very often. And if you catch them, you can take a quick look and then release them immediately, because you don't need to hang on to them. You just want to see how much black there is on the wing. And let's look at that now. So really helpfully, makes it easy to remember, the small white has a small amount of black. So it's smaller in size, but it's also got much less black on the wingtip. Remember the tip, look at the wingtips and wing edges. So the wingtip has much less black, and it doesn't come down the wing edge here very far at all. Like a little triangular cornice of darker material, but not really black. The large white has far more black scales, it's much darker, and it comes down the wing a long way. Look. If we look at this black spot here, it's called the cell spot. There's the one on the small white, there's the one on the large white. You can see that on a large white, there's so much black coming down the wing edge, it goes below the cell spot. Whereas on a small white, it doesn't come anywhere near. So small white, small amount of black, large white, large amount of black. Okay. And if, as I put here in bold, the large white has a large L shape, black, but it's not a very good L, is it? One thing you will also notice about these two butterflies is that this one has a single spot in the wing, whereas this has two, and a bit of a streak there that isn't well shown in this photo. But that doesn't distinguish the species. That's about whether it's a male or a female. So by looking at the amount of black on the wing, you should be able to tell me, and I'm just giving you pause there so you can all think to yourself, is that a large or a small white? How much black can you see on the wingtips? Yes, you're right. It's got very little black, sort of a grey smudge. It's a small white, and so is this. The black does not come down below the cell spot. Small whites, both of them, but this one has got more black in the center because it's a female. And this one has got a single black dot because it's a male. So we could swap these pictures out for large white or green veined white, and it would be the same thing. The male has got a single dot and the female has got several. So that's to tell the sex apart, but to tell the species, we're looking to see how much black is on the wingtips. Now, if you were to see a female brimstone, it would look white when it flew past you, but when it settles, you'll notice it's very pale green, extremely pale greenish color. The green veined white doesn't look green at all, actually. The green veined white looks just like a small white when it flies past. But when it settles, assuming it does, or if you catch it in a net, you'll see that along each vein, running here towards the wing edge, there are some grey scales. And what's really apparent is the way that they form little chevrons or arcs as they meet the wing edge. They come down as far as that cell spot. So there's a series of 3 or 4. In some green vein whites, there will only be 3, but in others which are more strongly marked, you get 4 of these little chevrons, and they come down to the cell spot. So the small, remember, the wing tips the only bits with any grey. In the large white, it's really black and comes round a corner in an L. Green vein white, you're looking for these little chevrons or arcs. Okay. The brimstone, of course, doesn't have any black marks at all. And it does have pointy wingtips, which is always a good clue. So we might see the butterfly settled. And the green vein white should be easy because you should be able to see the veins which are marked with grey scales. It's usually much clearer on the underside than it is on the upper side. So if you can see these grey marks along the veins, then you know you've got yourself a green vein white. The small white and the large white do look very similar, but look at this part of the small white's hind wing is a creamy colour, and there are not many grey scales. Most of them are below the midpoint. So there's the middle of the wing. Most of the grey scales are below that. Here's a large white. The grey scales are evenly distributed. So that helps us to tell a settled small white from a large white, and both of them from the green vein white because of the scales along the veins. Here they're just randomly scattered, and here they're mostly in this half. There's two more whites that you could see. There are two more whites you could see in the Upper Thames region. The orange tip, which has been well named, hasn't it? And the wood white, we'll come to that in a minute. Now, notice that the orange tip has a black and white checkering. So it does have some black in this tip here, but the thing that's most obvious is this black and white checkering to the wing edge. And if it's got its wings shut, this beautiful pattern, which I like the word filigree, so I should call it the filigree of green, which is actually made, if you look at it very closely, of yellow and grey scales overlapping. But a beautiful sight, a perched and closed up for the evening orange tip sitting on its, often on its food plant or perhaps on cow pasture where it blends in very well. But the orange tip on the male orange tipped wing is a real giveaway, and it's obvious at a distance that you're looking at an orange tip. This, by the way, is an orange tip egg, which is equally easy to spot. If you look at the food plant like this one, which is cuckoo flower or jack by the hedge, these orange eggs stand out really well laid on the seed pods normally. One thing though about the orange tip, which is just a bit confusing, is that the female orange tip, as you can see in the picture, doesn't have any orange. So it is an orange tip, but unfortunately the female orange tip has no orange, but she does still have the checkered edges to the wing. So you should see this, and you might be thinking, oh, is it a large white or a small white? There's quite a lot of black, but then notice the checkered edge. Let's go back to the small white and the large white, and you'll see that they don't have a checkered edge. So just completely plain, no checkering, top surface the same. Completely plain, a white edge, no checkering. Only the orange tip has this checkering. And of course, if the orange tipped female was to shut its wings, it would look like the male did, go back, it would be this pattern underneath. And I put the green vein white in because people, I'm not quite sure why, but people do mix these up. And I think they see the little arcs here coming in and think that reminds them of the checkering, but as you can see in the pictures, they are quite different. So we're looking for quite a large black tip here on an orange tip female, but with the obvious checkering. And the green vein white doesn't have the similar pattern, does it? Okay, now this is the last of the whites we find in our area, and unfortunately we don't find it very commonly. There are some on the border with Surrey in the Chiddingfold area, and there are some in the north of Bucks, in the area from Silverstone through possibly as far as Olney. So wood white, I think a beautiful butterfly, but one which can be confused, especially with the green veined white. Tends to fly in similar places, which is usually, not always, but usually in woodlands or on the edge of woodlands, which is where the green-veined white likes to fly to. Sometimes you find the wood white in slightly more open situations, but not often. And the way to tell the wood white from the green-veined white is by the grey scales and the way that they run. So in a wood white, the grey scales are distributed in lines across the wing look. Whereas in the green-veined white, the scales run along the veins. So these, in the wood white, they're not coming along the veins, are they? They're crossing the veins. So if you see a butterfly that's small, with a very fluttery flight, a large, not quite circular, but a large black spot there, and dark shading grey scales across the veins, that is one of the very rare wood whites. And there are only about 8 woods in our region where you'll find them. You're far more likely to see wood white. They fly together, these two species, by the way, in those few woods where the wood white is. But the green-veined white, quite different. It's the grey shading along the veins. And there is no black spot on the forewing look. And this butterfly flies very strongly, usually, whereas this one flies very feebly, usually. Looks like it doesn't really know where it's going and the wind is blowing it more than it's choosing to move. They can go big distances though, having said that. Okay, so those are the whites. Now we're on to the browns. And as I said earlier, there are only 2 browns flying in the spring, the speckled wood and the small heath. The speckled wood we already looked at. It's about the same size as a small tortoiseshell, but looks more chocolate than orange. And the small heath could be confused with some others that fly in the spring that we'll look at in a moment. So one of the confusion species that you could say, oh, was that a small heath, is small copper. But I would ask you to note that when it's got its wings open, the small copper is really dark here, almost black. When it's got its wings closed, the small copper, strangely, is very pale there, with an orange outer edge to its hind wing.
Sorry, Nick, do you want to just repeat that from the beginning? Because the internet connection, I think, went a bit.
Okay, yes. Yep, certainly. I'll go back a slide and I'll do that again. And
no, just start from the small copper is fine.
Thank you. Right. And I'll pause at the end of this brownie bit to see if we have any questions so far. So small copper, I was saying it's really should be quite easy to separate from the other butterflies, because if you see it with its wings open, it's got this dark area here. None of the other small orange butterflies have this solid black area and the orange outside it. And on the hind wing, strangely, that solid black area has become very pale, but there is still the orange outside it. No other small orangey butterfly has this pattern where the outer edge of the wing is so obviously orange. But it is similar to the butterfly we already mentioned, the small heath. The small heath, though, can be told, despite the fact, look, there's orange here, and orange here, there's sort of a grey edge and a grey edge. The small heath can be told from all the other species that look even remotely like it, because it's got this streak of pale colour between a darker centre and a pale grey outer. So the small copper, very dark if its wings are open, on the hind wings with an orange outer band, pale with an orange outer band if it's got its wings shut. And this is when it looks most like small heath. The small heath, by the way, you will never ever see with its wings open. But the small heath always has this really helpful, very pale streak that goes just a little bit more than halfway from the leading edge of the hind wing towards the hind part of the hind wing. No other butterfly of this size has a white streak like that, which makes it really quite easy to tell the small heath from the others. You're always looking, it always settles with its wings shut. And if you see anything with its wings shut you think might be a small heath, look for that pale streak. it stands out really clearly. There is a bigger butterfly that doesn't fly in the spring, which has a pale streak that goes right across the wing, but we'll worry about that in the summer when that one's around. The small heath is very easily told by that pale streak. Okay, I'll just pause and see if anyone had questions before we launch into a few more orangey butterflies of a small size. Hearing nothing, so I'm guessing, Carla, that you've got no questions to read me, and I shall move on.
No, there's no questions in the chat. It's just me filling it up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the small heath and the small copper, I suppose you might see fly past small orange butterflies and think that's strange. That could be a small heath or a small copper. And if you're in the right locations, and these are all in the children's, then it could be a Duke of Burgundy, because the Duke of Burgundy is also small and orange. But notice the small heath, I already told you, it's got this streak here between the dark centre and the pale outer. And the Duke of Burgundy is mostly orangey coloured, doesn't have any real difference between the dark centre and the pale outer, does it? It's pretty much the same orange all the way, but it's got these rows of cells which are very pale, almost white, and they form bands, 2 bands across the wing. If you see a Duke of Burgundy sitting with its wings in this position, then it is really immediately obvious that it isn't a small heath, because it's much more colourful for one thing, far more orange, but with 2 pale bands across, and the small heath with just 1. The Duke doesn't always sit with its wings shut. So the small heath does. The Duke can sit with its wings open if it chooses and it wants to warm up in the sun. And when it does so, it looks like this. And what I've still got the little red arrows from the previous slide. I do apologise. I didn't realise that I'd left those on. So anyway, you can see that the Duke, where it had those 2 rows of black-edged white, it's now got rows of black. But the small copper, to go back to it, was nothing like this. Small copper is orange with little black dots, look. And the Duke of Burgundy, not anything like the same colour orange. This is a much yellower colour, but with black bands, not black dots. Now, here is a confusion that is easily understood. If someone saw these and mixed them up, I don't think anyone would be surprised, especially if you didn't get much of a look at them. The marsh fritillary here is really quite colourful, and if you look at it, if you get a good look, you can see that it's made of lots of different colour, orange and cream and black and almost white in some parts. The Duke of Burgundy is far more uniformly coloured, mostly the same colour orange, and mostly the same colour black in the parts that aren't orange, if you see what I mean. So this is far more contrasty. And usually the marsh fritillary is quite a bit bigger. Excuse me a minute, everybody. I'm just going to ask my wife if she could turn the television down. Could you turn the television down, please? All right, so moving on, the blues. Here we are going to look at the ground colour because it is helpful, but the size of the butterfly is helpful too. And when you see them flying, their size is quite a good clue, because there's a really tiny one called the small blue and a not much bigger one called the brown argus. These 2 look rather silvery blue when they fly. Right down in the south of the county, in the southeast, we've got the silver-studded blue on the Berkshire heaths. That one also looks quite a silvery blue and is quite small. A little bit bigger and a much brighter blue, not quite so silvery. We've got the common blue and the holly blue. And the largest of the blues that fly in our area are the chalkhill and the Adonis. Well, the chalkhill doesn't fly in the spring, but the Adonis does. And the Adonis is slightly bigger than the common blue, and it's absolutely brilliant blue. So if something blue flies past, or silvery blue flies past in the spring, and it's tiny, it's small blue or brown Argus. If you're on the heathland of Berkshire, it could be a silver-studded blue, but that does look a bit bluer than both these. The common blue and the holly blue look very blue. The Adonis is startlingly blue, electric blue, and later in the summer, another confusing species is the purple hair streak, but you're not going to see that in the spring. I left it in here because I think it's worth knowing that there are quite a few, unfortunately, blues when they fly past, which could be confused with each other. So if a blue butterfly doesn't stop in a position where you can see it, then you might get a sense of how blue it was. And as I said, an electric blue, absolutely amazingly bright blue, is the Adonis blue. And people may have heard me say this before, but if someone says to you, I think I've just seen an Adonis blue, they didn't. Almost certainly they didn't. When you see an Adonis blue, you really know it. It is such a bright blue, it is obviously not some other species. It's strikingly blue. The common blue and holly blue, the holly blue is slightly paler, the common blue is slightly purpler, but they're a very similar colour blue. There are better ways of telling them apart than their colour. And the small blue and brown Argus both look silvery. If they don't stop, I'm afraid the answer to which one was it is that you cannot tell. You have to see them either flying extremely slowly, which is not likely, or stopped to tell them apart. But you probably can tell these apart, these three, the Adonis, common and holly, as they fly past. Adonis because it's so brilliant blue, the common blue because it's quite a nice bright blue colour and it flies close to the ground, and the holly blue because it's a similar nice bright blue colour, but it flies around hedges and trees and it's normally seen above head height. So common blue is down near the ground and the holly blue is much higher. Now, I produced this key, and obviously you haven't really got time to take all this in, but this recording we hope will go up on the website, and then you could, if you want, zoom forward to this bit. I don't mean zoom as in Zoom meeting, I mean zoom as in go quickly through, find this part, pause it, and have a look at this, but I'll just go through it quickly. What you're trying to do when you see a spring butterfly, spring blue, fly past you, is work out, first of all, does that blue butterfly look blue in the sense of really blue, or was it actually just a sort of silvery, perhaps even brown colour? Because the brown Argus and the small blue and some of the females of other species look silvery or brown even when they fly past. Whereas if it's blue, then that really reduces it to just 3 species down here. So let's suppose we see something which looks fairly silvery, but a bit brownish, not really very blue. Then we know it's either a brown Argus or a small blue, or one of the females. So then we ask ourselves, where am I? Where did I see it? Because if we're somewhere where there is kidney vetch, your very small, silvery, perhaps more brown looking than blue looking, was probably small blue. If it's away from kidney vetch, then it's probably either a female common blue or a brown Argus. But I'm afraid you can't tell. And I've put this point in. We have to accept we can't always tell the species of a butterfly that flies past us. It's just not possible. You can get a good idea, but you can't always be sure. So you shouldn't really record it on the basis that I think it probably was. That's not good enough for recording purposes. It might be good enough if you've just seen something you've never seen before in your life and you feel happy about it. But for recording, we should be certain before we make a note. Right, now on to the 4th point about is it blue. If it's very pale, average sized, flying around the tops of bushes, as I said, above head height, holly blue, almost without a doubt. And the holly blue is the one you're more likely to see in your garden. and it flies earlier in the spring. So I wouldn't be surprised if everyone listening into this talk this evening has already seen a holly blue. They've been pretty common, pretty prolific this year, and they fly around in gardens because there are lots of bushes in gardens that their caterpillars can eat. So they're quite common in gardens. If you saw, again, average size, if you saw an average sized blue butterfly, so we're still talking something quite small, remember, and it's a slightly more purpley blue, and it's flying much closer to the ground, perhaps around knee height, then that's almost certainly a common blue. And especially if you're away from places where the Adonis blue lives, which is only found in spots where you've got a plant called the not the bird's foot trefoil, I beg your pardon, the horseshoe vetch. So horseshoe vetch, which grows on chalk and limestone, doesn't grow on clay, is the food plant of the Adonis blue, and it's only found near that plant. So, as I say, you have to accept that you can't tell some of the blue butterflies apart when they fly past you, but if they stop, then you should be able to get a really good idea. If you're stuck with it flew past and it didn't stop and you didn't get a good look, were you near kidney vetch? Could the brownish silvery butterfly have been a small blue, which is tiny? If you weren't near kidney vetch, it's either a common blue female or a brown argus, but you can't really tell. You, as I put here, check the males nearby. If you can see male common blues and you saw what you think was a brownish female, then probably it was a brown female common blue, wasn't it? Makes sense. If it's a blue butterfly and the male and the female holly blue are both blue, and it's around the top of a bush, holly blue. If it's blue and near the ground, it's probably a common, but if you're somewhere where there is horseshoe vetch, it could be, if it's strikingly blue, Adonis. Okay. So let's look at these two, which are ones that need to be separated. If you see them flying in and then they settle near you, it's dead easy. If you see it flying towards you and it's blue and then it settles and it's almost white with little black streaks, like streaks from a calligraphy pen, holly blue. If you see it flying towards you or flying near you and it looks silvery, almost brown, then it settles and it's a very, very pale grey with circular spots ringed in white look, and it's a small blue. So holly blues, males and females are both blue. They look blue when they fly, and when they settle, they look white with little black streaks. Small blue is smaller, looks darker, looks quite silvery in flight actually, rather than blue. And when it settles, you'll see it's grey as opposed to white with circular spots. And I put this point at the bottom, this is really important. Neither of these two species has any red. There is no red anywhere on any of them. These two species are completely clear of any red, and that's important. Because all the other blues have some red. So here's a female common blue, which you can see has got some blue in the wings, but red lunules, as they're called, these red marks around just inside the edge. And here's a brown argus, which has also got these lunules or red marks just inside the edge. You'll notice that the brown argus, much more contrasted. The lunules, these red marks, are really strongly contrasted against a dark background, and they're a brighter red. The common blue, they're more orange, and they're less well contrasted. They're not as strikingly different from the base colour, the ground colour. So, brown argus, if we see these two, and we're not quite sure, how can we tell them apart? Maybe you've got a female common blue, which has got a bit less blue on it than this because they are variable. Well, for one thing, the female common blue always looks a little bit dowdy, and the brown argus, male and female, both look exactly like this, but really sharp, really smartly turned out, as if they were wearing their very best clothes, whereas this looks like it's wearing something ready to go out gardening. The common blue, and I like alliteration, the common blue has a clear border. Common blue has a clear border. All the way around the entire butterfly, the border is clear white. So common blue, clear border. Not the brown Argus. I hope you can see, I hope your screen shows it. The white margin to the wing is broken by black veins. On every single wing, there are black veins. So we can tell these two apart by looking at the wing edges. That's the first place to look. If you think to yourself when something settles, oh, that could be a brown Argus, look at the wing edge. Don't worry too much about the middle. If there are black veins going through the white margin, brown Argus. If there is a clear border, common blue. Now, if they're settled with their wings shut, the same thing applies precisely. We've got black veins through the white border on the brown Argus. See the veins coming through the border? Still there. Just as good a way of telling them apart, because we look at the common blue. Yes, there are some greyish smudges, but there's nothing like the same contrast in this white border. Still a clear border. And there's another way of telling them apart as well, because the spotting on the wings are different. You can see it says dot here. There's a little spot look just visible there. But here in the brown Argus, there's nothing. There's a bare space where that dot would have been. So if we come in from the edge look, you've got the edge markings, the lunules, then you've got a row of dots, then you've got this big one, which is the cell spot, and then one more. Coming from the wing edge here, we've got the lunules, the row of dots, the cell spot, and then a space. So the brown Argus has a bare area just here. And in addition, if we look at this little grouping of spots here, these two on a brown Argus are formed into what looks like a figure 8 or a colon. Over here, if we look at the common blue, all its spots are in this sort of shape of a C for common blue. And there isn't the same grouping together into an 8. This actually looks a bit like a question mark here, doesn't it? So you haven't got the same relatively smooth curve on the common blue on the Adonis. That curve has been broken, its spots are displaced, they don't make a nice smooth arc, and two of the spots come together to make what looks like an 8. So 3 ways to tell these two butterflies apart, which do trouble some people, but now you know. If it's a common blue, whether it's a male or a female, there is always a clear white border. If you're looking at the top surface, the common blue looks a bit dowdy, female looks a bit dowdy, and underneath it's got this lovely smooth curve with the spots there, plus a spot here which is completely missing. So the brown Argus does have the black veins through the white border. It does have 2 spots here which are sort of displaced from this smooth curve on the common blue to give you a little 8 or colon. And there's a gap here, a big grey area with no spots in it at all. And if the wings were open, the brown Argus would look really smart. They always look very fresh and very cleanly presented. There's the 8 in case you was having trouble spotting it. Okay, so male common blue and male Adonis blue. And having been told about the clear border on a common blue, you probably almost immediately jumped with your eyes because you've been listening that look at the wing edges, and you jumped to the Adonis and thought, oh, look at the wing edges. Now, isn't that helpful? I'm not quite sure who organised this, but someone somewhere must have had a bright idea and said, I think people are going to get a bit mixed up between these two because people are always hoping to see Adonis. And sometimes common blues look really pretty. They're very colourful. So let's make sure it's got a nice white border, completely clear of any veins. And the Adonis will make these black veins really obvious right at the edges. And then people won't mix them up. So if the butterfly is sitting with its wings open like this, the Adonis blue, I think you can see the colour is strikingly blue. But in addition, it's got black veins, just like the brown Argus. And the common blue always has clear borders. On the underside, the differences are more difficult to see in terms of pattern. There isn't a clear difference like there was in the pattern of the brown Argus and common blue, but we don't need to worry too much about that because we just look at the wing edges. And guess what? One of these two is a common blue with a clear border, and one of them is the Adonis blue, and you should be able to see which is which. You should be able to see which one of those has a clear white border. I'm hoping you got them the right way around. So looking at the wing edge, once again, is the trick to determining which of these two species. And as I do mention, I noticed my line at the bottom, I've forgotten to say this, that we are looking at butterflies which have some red on them. So here and here. This actually would stand out more strikingly if it wasn't the angle of the butterfly in this particular shot. So this red or orangey colour here is just as colourful as in this butterfly, but this one's slightly square on, slightly more square to the camera. This one's at a slight angle away, so that part of the wing isn't showing quite so clearly. But both these species have a really clear red border. Now, how do you think you're getting on with these? What do you reckon we're looking at here? You've seen quite a few pictures of blues. Some people say they're difficult. I hope you'd agree with me after we've been through it. There are some clear pointers in all of them, because now you know to look at the wing edges. So looking at the borders, this one's got black in one wing and clear border in the other. These are the same species, by the way. And here we've got clear borders all the way.
Do people want to put some suggestions in the chat if you kind of point out which ones, Nick, or?
Well, I was going to wait for a moment and see what people tell us. See what people say. So perhaps if you put down what you think the one on the right is first, because that's the one that should be easier. I see some people having a shot at it. I'll put everybody out of their agony and we'll see what people have got. So this is holly blue, which if you remember, I told you has no red. But I don't think I mentioned at the time, but now we've learned to look at the borders. One wing has got black veins through the white border and the other one has got a clear border. So another way to tell these species apart. And this is the one I'm hoping everybody's got right, because we can see a nice clear border. So common blue. But if for some reason you saw these flying in your garden and you weren't sure if you were looking at, because you were looking at the top surface, and you weren't sure if you're looking at a holly blue or a common blue because it was a little bit too far away for you to see whether it's got these black veins through the border. If it was then obligingly, butterflies don't often act obligingly, but if it was to be obliging and close its wings, you'd immediately see, oh, this one's a holly blue because it's almost all white with a few little black streaks and there is no red. But this one is a common blue because we can see this arc. I'd say they're a bit more orange than red, but they can look quite red. The colour varies slightly. So that's a good way to tell the two butterflies which are commonly seen in gardens apart. This one is commoner in gardens than this, but many people hear the name is common blue and assume what they've seen in their garden was a common blue because it's called common, but actually holly blue is more frequently seen in gardens. Okay, we're getting towards the end, people. If you've managed not to suffer a brain meltdown already. You're nearly there, because there are only two spring flying skipper species. They are both perplexingly difficult to follow in flight. They fly very close to the ground. They usually get startled off by you walking up to them. So if you're lucky, you'll see one flying towards you and it will stop close to you. But more often they're sitting on the floor or near the floor because that's warmer. And as they warm up, you walk towards them and then they zip away from you. And it makes it very difficult to see where they've gone because they're small. They fly in an erratic path. They don't follow a straight line. And as they go very quickly across the vegetation, they tend to, as it were, disappear as they jink left and right. So a tip is, assuming that you've seen a male, it will probably come back to where you scared it from. So if you just stay where you are, perhaps back off slightly so that it can come back to the plant it was on when you scared it, it should come back to where you were. If you know that you're going to be walking a circular route and coming back past the same point later, you could continue, and then when you get back to that point later to see if it's back on its plant, because they often have a particular bush or a particular group of plants that they take a perch on and watch out across it to see if any females are coming. So that's quite a useful tip for skippers, but by and large, if you do get to see them settle, they are easy, because one is strikingly black and white, or silvery grey and white. Both upper and lower surface, you can see a clear distinction between the pale and the dark parts. And the other one is rather less contrasted, with bands of darker cells here, and an overall grey-brown appearance. So unfortunately, this little butterfly is called the dingy skipper. It's still quite perky and fun, but it is, I'm afraid, not as colourful. Well, perhaps this isn't very colourful, but not as contrasted. It's not quite as striking as the grizzled skipper. The grizzled skipper is slightly smaller, but both these butterflies are small. When the grizzled skipper settles, you can see it's got the same sort of black and white pattern, very similar. The dingy skipper, when it settles, never closes its wings. It is the only British butterfly that does this. It almost always sits on a flower head, a seed pod, in this case knapweed, which is one of its favourite plants to sit on, and it wraps its wings around the plant. And although this might not sound very likely, because I chose a picture where the butterfly was obvious, if the butterfly has chosen a large enough old knapweed seed head, when it wraps itself around the seed head, this pattern on the wing here blends in with the natural pattern of the seed head, and it does disguise it very well. But it's peculiar among the British butterflies in not folding its wings over its back, but folding them forward and around a seed head. You might, if you go out on a cloudy day and you're thinking, what can I look for today? It's cloudy and there aren't that many butterflies. You might try looking at knapweed seed heads in the spring and looking for dingy skippers wrapped around you, because they will sit there and you can get very close. You won't scare them off if the temperature's a bit low and the sun isn't shining. So you'd think to yourself, well, that's easy then, isn't it? There's only two skippers. They're really small, they zip about, and if they stop, one of them is very well contrasted, quite dark, can be a bit silvery grey compared to the chocolatey brown of this one, but there's an obvious contrast with the grizzled skipper. The dingy skipper is less obvious. Then, of course, unfortunately, there is always a but, isn't there? And the but is that there is this moth, which looks, as you can see, quite a bit like the grizzled skipper. And this moth, which you can see, looks quite a bit like the Burnet companion, like the dingy skipper. So it's worth knowing before you set out and think you might have seen a skipper that there are potential confusions. This mother Shipton, can you see the mother Shipton? Here's her long nose and her eye, and then she's got her mouth open, and this is her big old chin. So there's her face. Mother Shipton was a famous and apparently ugly witch, but I guess you've got to be ugly to be a witch. And here's her face again on the other side. Look, long nose, eye, cheek, jaw sticking out with a big chin. Mother Shipton flies around at about the same time. It's slightly later. It will be coming on the wing now. The grizzle skipper's been flying for a couple of weeks already. The best way, actually, to tell this Mother Shipton and this Burnet companion moth from your skippers is that when you see them fly, both of the moths tend to get into the vegetation when they land. They don't sit right on the top, basking in the sun. They sometimes sit briefly, as this Burnet companion and Mother Shipton are doing very helpfully when I was trying to photograph them. They will sit briefly taking nectar, but then they tend to crawl underneath a leaf or dive down into the grass and get out of sight. The skippers always sit in a really obvious position. So if you see something you think was a skipper, but it dives into the vegetation and disappears purposefully, and it's not just that you didn't quite see where it landed, but you did see where it landed and you saw it bury itself in the vegetation, so to speak, then it'll be one of these, the moths. The butterflies always stay on the top because they're trying to warm up in the sun. Now we're just going to quickly look at some day-flying moths, because I would urge you, please do look at the day-flying moths. They're very pretty. The emperor is a day-flying moth which is just beginning to fly. You can actually buy little chemical lures that you can take out with you to attract them to you, because they're able to smell the lure for about 2 kilometers, and you can get any number of these coming to you if you're in the spot where the emperors are breeding. And they do breed all around the north of Bucks and north of Oxfordshire, and down on the moors, the heaths in parts of Berkshire as well. So the emperor is pretty widespread and well worth watching for. A very pretty moth, day flying. But there are lots of other day flying moths about. As I say, they're all worth looking for, I think. The silver Y moth, which has this little mark here, which is supposed to be the silver Y. The mint moth, or the small purple and gold, and the common purple and gold. These are beautiful, but they're tiny, absolutely tiny. Hummingbird hawk moth, you probably know. The small yellow underwing, which isn't much bigger than the mint moth, and you can see could be confused with it, but it doesn't have the little yellow patches on the forewing that the mint moth has got. And Mother Shipton that we just looked at, which you can see. I've done these to scale, so they are approximately the right sizes. However, all of them are bigger on the screen here than they are in real life. And there are quite a few day flying moths that look white when they fly, very small but white. So common carpet, which is definitely flying around at the minute. Treble bar, which will start very soon, which always looks this sort of triangular shape when it settles. The grass rivulet, that flies more like late May, and you won't find that unless you've got yellow rattle about. And the white plume, another beautiful moth, which is white, quite widespread actually. You could well see that in your garden. Lovely moth. So white day flying moths, and then there are some pale brown or sandy coloured shaded broadbar, common heath, and yellow shell. The yellow shell comes in various colour forms. Some are more yellow without this dark band, but those are yellowy orange. So you might see these and wonder, oh, is that a small heath? But have a look. Again, if they bury themselves in the vegetation when they land, they're more likely to be moths. You can spend hours following these moths, trying to get a picture of them without a piece of vegetation in the way. They're not very helpful, I'm afraid. Usually they bury themselves, which tells you it's a moth, but if you want a picture, that makes it tricky. And then there are green moths, small emerald, green carpet, and the forester, another one that flies a bit later, but it is sort of very much late spring and very early summer. So that will be flying at the end of May. But these are flying now, and you could well see them. I think the green carpet is absolutely beautiful personally. And they all fly by day. There are actually more moths that fly by day in the Upper Thames area than there are butterflies that fly by day, but because they're small, people tend not to look at them too closely. but please do, because they're beautiful. Okay, we're back to the butterflies, I think, with one more species, and this is it then. This is the only hair streak that flies in the spring, the green hair streak, and it is an absolute little cracker. It's surprisingly difficult to see it when it flies because it looks really dark chocolate brown. It doesn't look green at all. And even if you do see it, when it settles, it will settle very often on a leaf of a plant which is almost exactly the same colour green as it is. And so it disappears because it looks just like the vegetation. And these little beauties are very happy to sit completely still for 20 minutes. So you might see it fly to a bush, walk up to the bush, can't see it and think, I'll just stand here for a minute, it's bound to move and show me where it is, but they might not. So you have to be lucky with these, really. There are quite a few places in the Upper Thames region where you get good numbers of these. Usually where there are food plants like lots of bird's foot trefoil, possibly dogwood, one or two other things, broom and gorse, if you're down on the heaths. They can be quite numerous and they are absolutely beautiful, but they're tricky to see because when they fly, as I say, they look dark brown, which means you don't think of them as being a green butterfly. And when they settle, they're so well camouflaged and they sit motionless. But good luck, because I hope everybody gets to see a green hair streak. They're so beautiful. Only small, remember. It looks big in my picture, but they're not that big in real life. Well, they are that big in real life if you're immensely close to them, but you probably won't be. Finally, just to plug that if you go out and you see these butterflies, please tell us what you've seen, because we really do want the records. Our intention is to get records from everywhere, of everything that everyone sees, and then we can go back to the people who own the bits of land where the most special butterflies are, and they fly moths, and explain to them how they can make sure they keep them there and don't lose them, because I imagine all of you know that the real problem in this country is that we're losing wildlife all the time, forever disappearing. And sometimes it's because there's a deliberate decision to do something like build a new out-of-town shopping area or big warehousing area, new housing, new roads, new HS2. But other times it's purely unintentional and people just decide, well, I need somewhere to stack all this stuff, I'll just stack it over there. And that's the only bit that's important for a particular butterfly. So once we know all that, we can go to landowners and we can tell them. But if people don't record what they see, then we don't know it's there either. So please do record. And you can see that this is a free phone app, very easy to use. Once you've used it a couple of times, it becomes second nature. I record butterflies, very good. If you prefer doing it when you get home and using the notes you made in a notebook, there's the butterflies for the new millennium, which is on the Butterfly Conservation website. You can go on there and you can log in your sightings. You can see, you can enter your own records. You can explore the records that you've sent in over the years and everybody else's. And you can get downloads and print them out if you want. So this is another way of doing it, but again, it is using a computer. All of you listening to this, as you are tonight, presumably are relatively proficient and you could use the smartphone app or this way of doing it. But of course you can just record on paper. I haven't got anything here to show you that because you people are not paper users, I would imagine. You prefer using the IT systems. If you do know people who want to record on paper and send us the paper, we will accept records that way. And on the Upper Thames Branch website, you can even download forms so that you can fill it in and send us the detail the way we want it. I want to mention the fact that iRecord doesn't only have pages for iRecord of butterflies. You can get the iRecord app and you can do any groups at all that you're interested in. Literally any living thing at all can be recorded using iRecord. So it's a very useful tool to have on your smartphone when you're out and about and you see things and you think, oh, I ought to tell someone about that. I don't think that's a very common thing. I've never seen it before. Stick it into iRecord. Your phone will record where you are, so you haven't got to worry about trying to work out grid references and so on. And it's quite simple. You just push the picture of the thing you want to say, and if you want, you can use the plus buttons and so on to increase the numbers. You have to write in you have to register with this first so that they know who you are, so they can contact you about your sighting perhaps. But otherwise, it's quite straightforward to use it. Okay. I'm not quite sure why it says publish your event there, apart from the fact that we do run special training. So I don't think I meant to put publish your event, but we do run special training, and you can find recordings on the Upper Thames branch website about ways that you can both collect and submit your recordings. So if you're interested in learning a bit more detail about how to use those recording systems, that's all in a recording that was made and is now on the Upper Thames branch website. That's it. I'm hoping that some of you have got some questions, and we can go back to any of the slides that you want to refer to check out a point to see if you've understood it. So I really hope people have found that useful. I know it can be difficult to identify some of our butterflies because they look so much like others, but try to point you in the right direction, the things to look at first. Thanks very much. I'll keep quiet and we'll wait and see what, if anything, pops up in the chat.